this is phase zero of Russia's offensive or condition setting and preparation for potential future combat operations against NATO member states. It doesn't mean that the Kremlin's made the political decision to do that, but they're setting the conditions so that they can go when they want to. And this is a collection activity for the Russians. It's also a prodding activity. It's also a learning about NATO institutional weaknesses and finding where the fissures are between, the aligned states. And I think they're being quite successful so far, unfortunately.
Well, you describe that as a Russian phase zero, but you also described how the Iranians have used the tactics and learned from it. Do you think the Chinese are sitting watching as well and learning these tactics? And this coming together, as we've described it beforehand, as this axis of evil, or the Crink countries, and swapping tactics. If we saw a greater coordination between them from a global perspective, do you think that's something that our Western leaders need to sit up and wake up and suddenly realize that actually looking at a potential threat 3 to 5 to 7 to 10 years out is something that we need to recognize is going to come potentially in 1 to 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. The Chinese are learning from the Russian experience. I mean, they have a tremendous amount of military learning, and look, the Chinese are actually the ones that are enabling the Russian um, drone capabilities. They're also the ones that are enabling the Ukrainian drone capabilities because the Chinese are the best manufacturing powerhouse on the planet currently. But they're helping the Russians more, and they've taken some subtle steps to try to sabotage the Ukrainians. And the Chinese, due to the nature of their maritime domain dominated theater, are going to have different manifestations of the drones, but they're very interested in the unmanned surface and subsurface naval drones, the likes of which the Ukrainians have employed very successfully. And there are applications for the land-based warfare quadcopter drones as well, but the distance is a little bit different. So it's a little bit different, but absolutely. And yes, we need to be prepared to decisively defeat if we fail in deterring a Russian threat against, no more than 12 months after the end of active fighting in Ukraine, because the Russians are going to be able to reconstitute faster, and they do not need to reconstitute what they had pre-war to pose a significant threat um, against Ukraine and NATO. To that point, I'd also note that just yesterday, on the 13th of October, the Russian government recently passed a new draft amendment to Russia's military service law to actually allow the Russians to be able to send reservists to expeditionary military deployments, which is a major inflection because reservists previously were not eligible to do that, not able to do that under Russian law, unless the Russian government declared a state of war or state of mobilization. That now lowered the threshold for that. And I think this is a canary in the coal mine that indicates that the Russians are going to start changing their fourth generation strategy. They're going to start going after reservists because the previous system where they would recruit volunteers through large financial incentives, I think that's hitting diminishing returns, and they're no longer able to get the numbers they used to, despite increasing the wages higher and higher. So it doesn't mean the system's broken. They're just now going to tap into other resources, and we really, the Russians are quite resilient in that regard.
But it could also be an indication of the fact that to put reservists out into more benign operational theaters that Russia's in there, where they've just got their troops deployed supporting other things. If those can be replaced with reservists, they can bring those more professional troops back and use them on the front line in Ukraine. That will create a little bit of anxiety amongst those troops that are coming in, but could be a clear statement of just the real pain that Russia is suffering from a manpower perspective. Are you getting indications that Russia is properly suffering pain? Because we're up to certainly 1.1 million, and if not closer to 1.3 million casualties at the moment.
Yes. So yes, the Russians do have a manpower shortage problem. And I know that sounds ironic given that the Ukrainians also have a manpower shortage problem, but it's also true. And the attrition rates for the Russians are much, much worse for those than the Ukrainians. And in general, you do need a decisively larger attacker to defender ratio and large combat operations, as you know. So the equations are a little bit different here. But yes, that's true. We have noticed over the last year how the Russian strategy for recruits has been hitting diminishing returns. For example, the Russians have a federal budget for recruiting for the entire fiscal year 2025. They blew through their entire year-long budget in the first quarter of 2025, and they generated about 90,000 recruits out of that. There's many federal subjects, Russian oblasts and krais and that sort of thing, that have blown through their federal budgets as well, or rather their regional level budgets, but it's all Russia's rent here, so it all comes from the federal government. They've blown through their budgets as well to recruit these people. And then there was a Russian language RFERL investigation that was published just the other day that also found that these Russian federal subjects, despite pumping up the wages, which usually sort of demand and supply curve would pump up the number of volunteers, that started to no longer work. And so, you know, it doesn't mean Russia has no more people. They have more people, but it just means they're going to have to move away from this voluntary system into a compulsory system where they go after reservists. And here's where the Russians will play an information operation game, because the Russians are going to invest a lot of effort in framing this as voluntary service, because to become a reservist, you have to volunteer to be a reservist. You get paid monthly to be a reservist. You had to sign a contract to become a reservist. There's nothing compulsory about becoming a reservist. But once you've taken the trap and signed up to be a reservist, now they're changing the thresholds that the reservist can be sent. And the Russians are going to frame this as, well, you volunteered for the war when you volunteered to become a reservist. And that's really not quite true. And so insofar as I think that there's an effort here to try to exploit and shine a light on how Putin is starting to have to violate elements of his social contract with Russians, this is going to be a big part of it.
Yeah. Do you think that the Ukrainian tactic of attacking the Russian oil infrastructure and the way that that's translating into the Russian people in a number of different regions suffering shortages of petrol, diesel, and therefore affecting their day-to-day life is having an impact on the Russian people's thoughts as to how the government can keep them protected, and therefore that's having a secondary impact on ability to recruit and support for the operation or anything else? Or do you think the Russian people are becoming a bit like the Ukrainians and slightly more focused on protecting the homeland, and therefore it is increasing their resolve?
I think it's neither. I think most Russian citizens are fairly apathetic, and when there's less petrol available at their local gas station, that's just an annoyance and a bother, and that they might blame on the local governor or something. But it's not going to increase the propensity for relatively wealthy people. I mean, if you own a car in Russia, you're going to buy gas. You're already sort of categorically not part of that very poor class that were the ones that were most susceptible to the financial incentive to join. So there's a sort of that selection bias and implicit in the question there. And then most Russians, I think, are actually quite fine and apathetic about the state of the war, what's going on. I think the effect is most important for how it affects Russian Federation's bottom line with their revenues. But I don't think it actually does a whole lot in terms of hearts and minds. I think the Russians will continue to fight as long as the Russian state calls them to do so.
So effectively, what we're saying is that it's still stalemate on the front line, and there's no real move forward. We've got Zelensky meeting Trump in Washington on Friday. What should we be telling POTUS that he should be doing to support President Zelensky in trying to change and move away from this this status quo that the conflict has sort of become? Where it is almost culminated for both sides. What does he need to do to help move things on?
Yeah, so we need to start thinking about how to rebuild Ukraine's mid-range operational range strikes capability. I think we talked about that the last time that we spoke. So that's very important, and there's things that we can do to do that. But look, we're currently in a big policy debate about, do we send Ukraine Tomahawks? And I would argue that we should send Ukraine Tomahawks, even if it's a small number. I know that the United States doesn't have a large number of Tomahawks to give, but I would argue that even a small number of Tomahawks, if used intelligently and effectively, could have a very important effect on the war. For example, the Russians have a factory that produces Shahed Iranian drones for the one-way attack drones. It's in Tartarstan, and if you look at that factory, you probably don't. You'll need a larger than 10 number of tomahawks, but a smaller than 50 number of tomahawks to severely damage that facility. And I think taking that facility offline would be quite good because it has the production capacity to make 2,700 drones a month that Russians launch every few days, 500 plus of these drones at Ukraine, not just for the strategic long-range bombing campaign, but also increasingly for frontline strikes. We'll see occasionally heads used to strike frontline or middle-range operational range targets too. That's a huge capability that's scaled up, and we forget that Russia is actually dependent on external supporters and backers. They're dependent on a shadow fleet that the Russians don't own. They're dependent on Iranian drone capabilities. They're dependent on artillery provided by North Korea. And if we can start to erode some of these support buttresses that come internationally to Russia, that can actually, I think, impose sufficient problems on Putin that will cause him to go to the negotiating table. And crucially, POTUS is in the right mindset to accept this sort of argument right now, because as we know, he has just through brute force discovered that the Russians are not willing to negotiate, and he has enabled the U.S. intelligence community to help make these Ukrainian strikes against the Russian oil infrastructure and the gas infrastructure that much more effective. So the president understands, to get the Russians to the table, you have to degrade them.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.